Hey, what's up, everybody? Onepeg here. We have another document from the court case between Nexon and Ironmace. In this case, this is a reply from the defendant regarding the opposition that they have to the stay that the defense has requested, asking for the discovery process to be put on hold. Now, this document is relatively short, actually. There isn't a whole lot here to have to go over. However, for those of you wanting a TLDR, this is a reiteration, basically, on the case of the defense by saying that their grounds absolutely stand, and they offer support as to why. They also tend to poke a ton of holes, again, in Nexon's, allegations toward that of the defense. And there's a couple of like whammy moments in here that I want to go over. Now, just a few days ago, Nexon ended up submitting an opposition to the stay request from that of the defense, basically saying that it shouldn't have a stay because the forum, the court that the defense is saying is not an adequate forum, and how the case should be moved to Korea, which I also agree with, how that isn't good enough of a reason. And they cited a bunch of case law, how that isn't a good enough reason to end up actually moving this case. Now, the defense states that they have a strong enough motion in wait for this forum nonconvenience request that they've submitted to say that it should be moved to Korea and that it should be vacated from the U.S. court. However, Nexon obviously opposes that because Nexon, honestly, in my opinion, is looking to just try to draw this out as long as they can. The attorneys especially are looking at this as a blank check. They have unlimited billable hours that they could end up knocking this for because Nexon has very, very deep pockets. Although, Nexon alleges that the defense also has extremely deep pockets because if they employ 30 people in Korea, they must naturally end up having a whole lot of venture capital cash, and they're running off of some unknown investor that is funding them through this entire effort. Otherwise, why would they bother fighting it to begin with? Anyway, this says that there's good cause to stay the discovery. If the court grants the FNC motion, this action will end. For that reason, courts routinely grant stays of discovery while a forum nonconvenience motion is pending. He then goes on to say, courts do this, of course, because a successful forum nonconvenience motion ends the litigation in that forum. Then there's a footnote here. Defendants also cited in their moving papers, this case SSI Inc. versus Ferry. Contrary to Nexon's assertions, the court in SSI did grant a motion to stay based on a pending forum nonconvenience motion. Nexon attempts to distinguish the case by taking out of context a statement the court made, declining to adopt the argument that forum nonconvenience invariably requires a stay of discovery, so the court concluded a stay was nevertheless warranted. So in this case, the plaintiff cited a case where the motion actually got granted. It just didn't get granted for the exact reason that Nexon attempted to quote, which is interesting considering that the plaintiff had a case that they ended up citing that actually opposes their own position. The FNC motion can be decided without additional discovery. Nexon argues the FNC motion raises factual issues and so a stay is improper. But that is not the standard. Instead, courts consider whether the pending motion may be decided without additional discovery. Nexon has conceded it needs no further discovery to oppose the FNC motion. Indeed, the motion is fully briefed. This factor too favors a stay. The risk of prejudice to the defendant supports granting a stay. So one of the things that the plaintiff stated in their last filing was to say that the plaintiff actually would be prejudiced against if the stay were granted because the plaintiff deserves to have an expedited process. However, I would argue that this process would be far from expedited considering all of the evidence that would need to be translated from Korean into English. They even also went on to say, or the plaintiff tried to say, that the discovery process for the defense is being blown out of proportion because there would be an awful lot of evidence that would not be relevant and that the defense wouldn't have to translate all that much, basically, and tried to ascertain what the defense would consider to be relevant, which I thought was interesting. Why the opposite side of the fence would be trying to dictate what was relevant and what wasn't relevant to the other side seemed very, very odd to me. Although this is par for the course because Nexon has tried to do this several times. In their original complaint even, they tried tried to say that the reason why Ironmace stole all of the information that they did was because they knew that the game that they were creating was going to be successful when they worked at Nexon. It was greenlit. It was destined for success. And the only reason why the game has done as well as it did is because Nexon had already predetermined that the game was going to be very good. Although in, I think, 10 or 12 cases of these same devs working on projects prior to this one, in every single project they had worked on up to this point, all of them were canceled by Nexon as they went by. So really strange. Nexon severely downplays the prejudice to defendants if discovery commences here, suggesting that discovery in the U.S. is no more burdensome than if it proceeded in Korea. But Nexon ignores the massive language barrier. All relevant evidence will be in Korean. Well, Nexon blithely suggests that some documents, such as the party's DMC correspondence, are in English. 2 letters exchanged by U.S. counsel do not tip the scales given the scope of evidence in Korean. This dispute is about whether defendants misappropriated trade secrets from Nexon and whether the game they designed infringes on copyrights. If Nexon's approach to litigating this case so far is any indication, it will likely seek burdensome and wide-ranging discovery. I completely agree. The key evidence will involve, among other things, emails among Nexon's P3 project team, reflecting P3 development and the work Choin Park performed, project notes, planning documents, market research, and purported trade secrets developed by Nexon, emails, project notes, planning documents, and other documentation of the development of Dark and Darker by defendants. All of them are in Korean. Nexon's suggestion that some bilingual people working for defendants can simply determine what is relevant and isolate that material for translation is wholly unrealistic. Discovery involves more than hand-selecting a few relevant documents. It involves identification of sources of information and custodians, collection of that material, and painstaking review to determine if any material has the potential to lead to discovery of admissible evidence. Translation will be necessary even to ascertain what might be relevant. Yeah, I mean, how would you know what you have until you end up seeing all of it, and then you make the determination on what is relevant and what isn't? The idea that the plaintiff would be trying to determine what is relevant to the defense is a little bit weird. This inherent burden that causes courts to grant discovery stays pending a forum nonconvenience motion. And then they cite cases for it. Conducting extensive discovery in a foreign jurisdiction is likely to be expensive and time-consuming both for the courts and the parties. Requiring foreign defendants, all of whom are located in Korea, and relevant documents being in Korean, to conduct discovery in the U.S. would be unduly burdensome. And then there's a footnote here as well. Nexon speculates without evidence that this burden should be discounted because defendants must have deep-pocketed backers. Must have, because they know, right? A party need not be on the brink of insolvency to be spared from undue burden, nor must the court evaluate confidential financial records to conclude that a discovery in foreign language in a foreign litigation is expensive and burdensome. Nexon seems to chafe at the suggestion that it is a large company trying to put a small company out of business. It is only itself to blame for that. Oh, Nexon. A delay of the commencement of discovery at the outset of a case is not inherently prejudicial. And then they cite a case where that is the case. New World will not be prejudiced by the requested extension as this case is in its infancy and no discovery has been planned. There you go. Nexon's only argument is that there is a risk of ongoing harm because defendants are continuing to develop an infringing game. This argument is, of course, speculative. More to the point, Nexon has already moved for a preliminary injunction in Korea to halt the distribution of Dark and Darker. If there were any ongoing harm, the Korean proceeding will be able to address it in full. By contrast, this newly filed U.S. litigation will not be resolved for many months, if not years. That timetable does not meaningfully change if discovery is deferred pending resolution of the FNC motion. And I agree. This is one of those things where you can already tell if it stays in the U.S. with the amount of translating that's going to be going on and the arguing over certified documents of those translations, which is already happening, you could see how this would be drug on for literal years in court. There's no way that it wouldn't be. Nexon also suggests that a stay might be prejudicial because it would only increase the likelihood that critical evidence will be unavailable once discovery begins. Nexon bases that argument on its false allegation that defendants have concealed evidence. Remember, they have stated repeatedly in their own filings that they are stealing evidence over and over and over again. They don't bother to say alleged. They just say, well, they've stolen infringing stuff, right? But fears about document preservation do not warrant denial of a stay because defendants are required to keep all relevant documents once a potential claim is ascertained. So what they're talking about now is that, legally speaking, as soon as the complaint were filed with the court, and from that moment moving forward, there was a running log of what it is that you have and what it is that you must provide to the court, meaning that you can't delete get rid of anything. So if they made iterative changes to the game, they still have to have older versions of the game that could be ended up calling in or called in on evidence. And they can't really get rid of any of the paper trail. Assuming that that is true, that means that Nexon can't just assume that the documents wouldn't be preserved. They have to be legally. Now, could Ironmace break the law and go behind the back of this entire thing and start deleting stuff anyway? Of course. We see that happen in a wide variety of court cases. But in a lot of those cases, things get caught. People end up being found out. Those kind of things end up being discovered in discovery, and people get in trouble for that kind of stuff. Usually, judges don't really look at those things favorably, and then penalties start being awarded to people, right? Granting a stay because much of the evidence involved in this case will be documentary, and defendants are already under duty to preserve that information. So they cited a couple of cases where there is a requirement to make sure that you hold on to those documents. And I think in this case, Ironmace would want to. I think Ironmace is very much of the opinion that they are in the right and have been repeatedly willing to show whatever needs to be shown. In the case of all of this source code, though, again, Nexon could have made the request for it and just didn't because they said that it was going to take too long, or that there was going to be a delay, which apparently they don't want, even though they're trying to force this into a situation where there would be significant delays and significant man hours over translating documents, but, you know, whatever. Courts in the district may take what is characterized as a preliminary peek. So what now they're talking about is the merit of, or the likelihood that the motion for this forum nonconvenience deal to be granted, and that the court could take a look at this, very much similar to how Valve's attorneys took a look at the DMCA request that was originally filed to see whether or not it was good enough, right? Could it have some legs to stand on? And that's really what they're talking about here, is that whether or not the motion has any legs. The court need not conclude that the pending dispositive motion is guaranteed to succeed or inevitable, as Nexon characterizes the standard. Rather, it is enough that the moving papers show there is a real question whether the claims will be able to proceed. Preliminary peek confirms that this action should not proceed in the United States, meaning that the motion should be granted and that the court case shouldn't continue. First and foremost, Nexon has done nothing to rebut the presumptive validity of the governing Korean forum selection clauses. Now, they're going to go into a couple of bullets here about Nexon's claims with this whole deal between Seoul and Suwon. Nexon has contracts with their employees that say that if there's any type of dispute, it's going to be litigated in a Seoul, Korea court. Right now, Ironmace filed a case against that of Nexon to get Nexon to stop bullying them, basically, on this DMCA stuff, trying to get an injunction against Nexon to not DMCA them anymore. Nexon countersued in that same courthouse. Instead of going to Seoul and filing something in copyright trade infringement and all this other stuff, trade secrets, they didn't re-sue them. They didn't file suit in Seoul. They just countersued them in the same Suwon court. Now, they could go to Seoul and file another lawsuit there if they wanted to, but they haven't done that. And the burden in this case, I don't believe, is on Ironmace to do that either. In Ironmace's case, they're literally just trying to get Nexon to stop bullying them. That's basically what the injunction was that they filed for. Nexon instead turned around and started filing against copyright and all the stuff that is cited in those employment papers. Completely different animal. But Nexon is trying to use that to their advantage by saying, well, we agreed that we were going to fight it in Seoul, but we're not fighting it in Seoul, therefore those contracts are voided. So Nexon's claims of Choyan Park misappropriated trade secrets in violation of their employment agreements and acknowledgments about company IP, and formed a new company, Ironmace, through which they have continued to misuse Nexon's trade secrets and infringe its copyrights. That's what Nexon claims. They also claim the relevant agreements have mandatory forum selection clauses requiring them to disputes relating to the contracts to be heard exclusively in the Seoul District Court in Korea. Nexon's claims are therefore governed by those forum selection clauses. In the face of this straightforward argument, Nexon offered two responses. There might be alternate translations of the phrase relating to, and in which case they tried to have the response of the defense stricken from the record. They wanted those thrown out because apparently Ironmace had the gall to respond to them and didn't mention that they had an expert ahead of time, but we're not in discovery, so I don't see why they would have to. Second, that a Korean court applying Korean law would not understand the forum selection clauses to govern this U.S. action. Agreed. These arguments are meritless. Nexon did not offer a certified translation contradicting the certified translations that the defendants submitted. So in the original motion that the defense submitted, defense said, here's our translation of the documents. That was a certified document. The response from Nexon was using their own declaration from their own expert, and their own expert tried to refute that by saying, well, there's alternative translations that could have been made here. However, that translation was not certified. And then there was a response to that response back from Ironmace, which again was certified, but Nexon tried to have struck. But again, whatever. Again, in response to Nexon's out of left field argument that Korean words do not mean what they say, defendants submitted a rebuttal declaration from a Korean language professor who affirmed the words meant relating to and not arising under, as well as a rebuttal from a professor of Korean law. But Nexon's argument are a sideshow. It is federal law, not Korean law, that governs the scope of forum selection clauses, which I completely agree with again, because right now they're arguing over a Korean legal document as that pertains to United States law, which it doesn't really at all to begin with, but is being used as a matter of example and shouldn't really have any real bearing on this at all, other than to say that there is a Korean contract already in existence that says that they would agree to fight this out in Korea, and they're not trying to do that right now. Well, they're doing it, but they're also doing it in the U.S. In light of the controlling forum selection clauses, all the court must consider is whether Korea is an adequate and available alternative forum, whether the public interest favors dismissal. Even a cursory examination confirms both. And then we go on to this whole issue again with source code. Nexon has already filed litigation against the defendants in Korea. To hide from this conclusion, Nexon argued that because the parties are currently litigating in Suwon and not Seoul, Seoul is not an available forum. Nexon never had any authority for this proposition, and defendants rebutted it with evidence that they never denied the jurisdiction of the Seoul District Court and would readily submit to it if Nexon chose to litigate in Seoul rather than Suwon. Nexon also argued that Korea is inadequate because Nexon was unable to obtain source code in the Korean litigation. Now, in the last time that we talked about this, Aaron Moss responded to this in bold italics. Now we have bold italicized and underlined. In reply, defendants explained that the unavailability of discovery would not render an alternative forum inadequate, and that Nexon misled the court because Nexon had never even asked the Korean court to order production of source code, which it could have done. There you go. There's a footnote here as well. Nexon concedes this in its surreply, simply arguing that it chose not to pursue this discovery yet, and I quote, because time is of the essence in preliminary injunction proceedings and the document request procedures are rarely used as they are too time consuming. So they just didn't want to wait. Nexon does not dispute that it could have sought the document production order already but did not, and if the Korean litigation proceeds past the preliminary injunction stage, Nexon will have ample time and opportunity to seek such an order then. I really don't understand what they're trying to argue. Maybe you guys do, because I don't. Nexon. I just don't get it. As to the public interest factors, Washington and its citizens have no interest in a dispute between Korean parties over conduct that took place entirely in Korea. If the court were to consider the private interest factors, those overwhelmingly support dismissal, as the likely witnesses are in Korea and speak Korean. Nexon has never presented any meaningful counter-argument to address those obvious burdens. And so signed by Aaron J. Moss. That's pretty much it. This, to me, feels like a dunk. Every time Nexon has tried to make whatever claims they have, it's either been just because it's been inconvenient for Nexon to have done a certain thing a certain way or inconvenient to the attorneys. Things are going to take too long in the Korean court. They just didn't want to wait. Impatience. But it's veiled impatience, because the moment that this thing got to the point where it was in discovery in the United States, the discovery process in and of itself will take forever. It's going to be 6 months for discovery to conclude. There's no way that they're going to have enough time to be able to translate everything, get all of those documents certified at great expense, and then have all of that ready to roll for a court trial inside of a couple of months. Not to mention the backlog in this court is estimated to be a year. In the case of the Korean court, the estimated duration of wait before the Korean court would hear it, I guess, is upwards of 2 years. So no matter what happens, if these proceed past these pre-trial and preliminary injunction phases, it's going to be a very long time before Ironmace's case sees the light of day, or Ironmace's game sees the light of day, unless this motion for an inconvenient forum is granted. If that is granted, DMCA gets vacated, and then we would see this game back on Steam. So, say a little prayer, because it might be another month or two before we end up seeing what the resolution to this pre-trial stuff is. But if this motion is granted, it's very likely we'll see Dark and Darker back on the market. And I hope so. Because I just, I want to open a treasure chest and fight a mimic, and you know what I mean? Sag. All right, guys. Thanks so much for coming and checking this out. I'll see you in the next one. If you would be so kind as to sub the channel here, that would be amazing. As always, you can find me over at twitch.tv/Onepeg, where I am also streaming simultaneously on TikTok now. So we'll see you there. Follow me on TikTok, maybe. That'd be pretty cool. All right. We'll see you soon. Peace.